The Great Western Railway is probably one of the most famous and notable railway companies in Great Britain, if not the world. Why is it so famous? Is it because of its famous beginnings through Brunel and the broad gauge, or because it was the only railway in Britain to celebrate a centenary while it was still in operation? Essentially, it has gained such a following because of the innovations in rolling stock and infrastructure it created and the influence that it had on other railway companies in Britain. Innovation on the Great Western began when the railway was still running on Brunel's famous broad gauge, a track width of 7 feet which allowed fast running of trains because the locomotives had a low centre of gravity because their boilers could be pitched lower in the frames. In 1839, the Great Western was the first railway to install the electric telegraph, a system that would be adopted by railways for communication between signal boxes in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Great Western Railway pioneered in rolling stock technology before they had to convert to standard gauge, a track width of 4 foot 8.5 inches and almost universal track gauge that the GWR had to convert to in order to become the same as other railways in the country. Some of these areas that would seem obvious today were the first Royal Train, special postal trains, a common sight in the 19th and 20th centuries, and even the first corridor train with toilet services, something we would take for granted on the trains of today. At the turn of the 20th century, when Churchwood had taken over from the top job from William Dean, who was in failing health, modern innovation began on the Great Western. Churchwood was beginning to design his new standard locomotives. He was heavily involved in standardisation, a policy that meant that many locomotives had interchangeable parts with each other, this making economic sense. It was also innovative because locomotives were cheaper to build and run, because less new parts had to be made for differentiating locomotive classes.
Part of Churchwood's new policy was his new tapered boilers on his locomotives. This was a noticeable improvement in technology over the older parallel boiler design. The advantage of tapered boilers is that there is always more water at the hotter rear end of the boiler, so it produces steam far more efficiently than a parallel boiler. This innovation meant that less coal and water had to be used to create steam than a parallel boiler engine would, making them cheaper to run. The tapered boiler was first trialled on Churchwood's City class. The Cities looked very Edwardian with double frames and the fact that it was an inside cylinder 440 tender locomotive. However, with Churchwood's new tapered boiler, the Cities were fast machines, so fast that on the 9th of May 1904, City of Truro was clocked doing 102.3 miles an hour down Wellington Bank in Somerset, the first 100 mile an hour run by a steam locomotive. However, the claim has been debated ever since because there was no speed odometer on the run, only timings. The official first 100 mile an hour run was by London North Eastern Railway A3 class Flying Scotsman in 1934, but City of Truro definitely proved that the Churchwood tapered boiler had its merits.
Churchwood designed some truly great locomotives during his time as CME, and one of his best and most influential designs was the Saint class. One part of the Saint design that made it so successful was its long travel piston valves. The long travel of the piston valves allowed more steam to get from the boiler to the cylinders than a short travel piston valve would at any one time. This meant that the Saints could use less steam to generate the same amount of power as the equivalent short travel valve engine. Long travel meant that less steam had to be used than short travel, and therefore less coal and water had to be used to create the steam. This, along with the new tapered boilers, made the Saint class a very modern and economical engine for its time.
A few years later, Churchwood designed another locomotive for express trains, the Star class. The Stars to a casual onlooker looked very similar to the Saints. However, they had two key differences that made them unique. They had Walshart's valve gear as opposed to Stephenson valve gear, and they had 4 cylinders as opposed to 2 cylinders. Walshart's valve gear allows for locomotives to run fast, and 4 cylinders has more power than a 2-cylinder locomotive. These design features make an ideal express passenger locomotive because they are powerful and fast. In 1922, Churchwood retired from the Great Western, forever leaving his mark on the company with his innovative locomotive design features. He was replaced by Charles Benjamin Collett as Chief Mechanical Engineer. Collett's first task as CME was to update the Great Western's top express passenger locomotive because the Stars were starting to struggle with the increasing passenger loads. Collett's solution was the Castle class, which appeared in 1923. Collett was not as innovative as Churchwood, however he did not have to be with the quality designs Churchwood had left the GWR. So to increase power, Collett fitted a bigger boiler and larger cylinders to the Star chassis. He also fitted a more weatherproof cab, which would become a standard for tender locomotives of the Collett era. This increased the power, but still kept the new locomotive within the desired weight enforced by the civil engineer. Although not completely new, the Castle class would prove to be a revolutionary design, thanks to Churchwood's design features of high boiler pressure, tapered boilers, and long travel piston valves.
The 1925 exchange trials between various members of the Castle and A1 classes was to result in a considerable amount of Great Western influence on the LNER. The results of these trials showed that the two classes produced the same amount of power, but the Castle was more fuel efficient than the A1. This caused the LNER engineers to wonder why their locomotive had performed poorly compared to the GWR machine. One of the Castle classes that was on trial was examined by the LNER engineers at Doncaster, the LNER's workshops, and it was found that the long travel valves on the Castle made it 10% more fuel efficient during the trials. The LNER took these results on board and altered the valves on their locomotives, as well as increasing the boiler pressure to make the locomotives more powerful. This reclassified the A1 class to the A3 class, and it is in this form that Flying Scotsman reached their first official 100-mile-an-hour run in 1934. This wasn't to be the last time that the Castle influenced other railways in locomotive design. A year later, the London Midland and Scottish Railway was in dire need of a more powerful express passenger locomotive. So the general manager of the GWR, Sir Felix Pole, asked if they would like to borrow a Castle for trials on the LMS main line. The Castle proved so successful that the LMS asked the Great Western to build Castles for the LMS under licence, but this was rejected because the redesigning would have been necessary to fit the LMS loading gauge. This caused the LMS to design and build the Royal Scot class, which, like the LNER A3s, were designed on similar principles to that of a Castle. The new 3-cylinder long travel valve Royal Scots were fine engines that could finally match the performances of the LNER A3s on London to Scotland services, thanks to Great Western influence. The LMS still needed more modern locomotives, so they headhunted William Stanier from the GWR to update their fleet.
The Black 5 had noticeable Great Western influence as Stanier had designed it on the basis of the Great Western Hall class. Both classes sharing the same features of a tapered boiler pressed to 225 psi and 6-foot driving wheels. These versatile maids of work of the Great Western and the LMS were probably some of the most successful locomotives built by a British railway company. 8F was another one of Stanier's masterpieces, thanks to Great Western innovations for their basic design. They featured tapered boilers and were a 280 wheel design. They were designed primarily for freight, as were the GWR 2800s designed by Churchwood 30 years earlier. The 2800 class, first designed by Churchwood in 1903, were the first 280 wheel arrangement in Great Britain. This wheel arrangement would become the basis for freight locomotives in Great Britain. These innovations may have all been mainline related, but the Great Western's real innovations were in branch line operation. In 1905, the Great Western came up with the innovative idea of the auto train. This new concept, whereby specially designed coaches with various controls of the locomotive at one end were attached to locomotives with the linkages to the controls in the coaches. This allowed the train to be driven from the coach backwards, so there was no need for the locomotive to run around the train and be attached at the other end to go the other way. This was innovative because the system meant that the auto train service was less time consuming than regular trains. This enabled more trains to be run in less time and more money could be made by the company. The Great Western went one better in 1934 when they introduced their new diesel railcars built by AEC, Associated Equipment Co. Railcars have been tried by railways before, however they proved to be unsuccessful. However, it was the new railcars that were the true first successful railcars in the United Kingdom. Due to the railcars being able to be driven from both ends, they were like auto trains and were less time consuming than regular trains. The last pair of railcars were only built with a cab at one end, only so they could be operated back to back or with an extra coach attached in the middle. The Great Western railcars were very modern for their time, that they influenced, in Britain at least, the diesel multiple units that are seen so much today.
It is evident that the Great Western Railway was an innovative and influential railway company in Great Britain. The innovations of tapered boilers, long travel piston valves, auto trains and railcars, to name a few, greatly improved railway rolling stock performance and travel standards, not only within the Great Western Railway system, but throughout many parts of Great Britain.